All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to today's Explainer. Look, whether your organization is dealing with operational drag, emerging cyber threats, or just trying to avoid massive compliance failures, we've got to talk about the gold standard for keeping things secure. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the high stakes of business defense with the COSO framework for internal control.
So, what actually stands between a business and total, utter chaos? Seriously, it's not a rhetorical question. We see the headlines all the time, right? Massive corporate fraud, overnight bankruptcies, brutal data breaches. What really stops your organization from becoming tomorrow's cautionary tale? Well, it boils down to having a really robust system of internal controls.
Because let's face it, businesses are literally dodging landmines every single day. Without a solid defense system in place, you're totally vulnerable. We're talking asset misappropriation, like someone skimming payroll, catastrophic data breaches, regulatory penalties that'll make your eyes water, and reputational damage that can take years to fix. These aren't just hypothetical what-ifs. Without controls, manipulated financials and stolen data become harsh, incredibly expensive realities. Okay, here is our mental map for today's Explainer. First up, why internal controls matter. Second, we'll demystify the famous COSO cube. Third, we'll break down the 5 core components. Fourth, we'll see COSO in action with procurement. And finally, best practices and benefits. Let's get to it. Section 1, why internal controls matter. This is your absolute first line of defense. Building these controls isn't just some regulatory checkbox exercise. It's about building a living, breathing defense system. Enter COSO. Let's unpack that acronym real quick. It stands for the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission. Basically, it's a U.S. private sector initiative that's become the undisputed global standard for risk management. It originally launched back in 1992, but got a major update in 2013 to keep up with wild technological advancements. Its whole mission? To help you nail your operational, reporting, and compliance objectives.
Moving on to Section 2, demystifying the COSO cube, your 3D defense system.
If you've ever heard people talk about COSO, you've probably heard about the cube. It's this brilliant 3D model that shows how the framework actually works in the real world. Across the top, you've got your 3 main organizational objectives: operations, reporting, and compliance. Down the side, you have the organizational structure, showing how this trickles down from the massive entity level all the way to a specific business function. And facing forward, you've got the internal control components. The big takeaway here is that these pieces can't exist in a vacuum. Your objectives, your corporate hierarchy, and your specific controls have to tightly interlock for the whole shebang to work. Which brings us nicely to Section 3. The 5 core components. This is the real anatomy of your defense. All right, let's break down these 5 interconnected components, starting with number 1, the control environment. You can think of this as the absolute bedrock of the entire structure. It's all about the organization's culture, its ethical values, board oversight, and management's philosophy. Why does this matter so much? Well, think about it. If management is constantly bypassing their own approval processes, employees are going to pick up on that immediately and treat all controls like a joke. The tone is set at the top, right? Without a strong ethical foundation, the rest of the framework just crumbles. Component number 2 is risk assessment. And honestly, you need to treat this like a high-stakes security briefing. First, you define your objectives. Then, you identify what threatens them. Finally, you assess the likelihood and the impact. You're basically mapping out existential threats step by step. A cyber attack? High likelihood, high impact. Inventory theft might just be a medium across the board. A regulatory fine could be low likelihood, but the impact is massively high. Once you've got this map, leadership can figure out the right response. Do we accept, avoid, transfer, or mitigate it? Third up, we have control activities. These are the actual boots-on-the-ground policies designed to mitigate the risks we just mapped out. They can be preventative, like a password lock, or detective, like an internal audit. Here's a classic preventive control: segregation of duties. Literally making sure one person doesn't hold all the keys, because relying purely on the honor system for the corporate checkbook rarely ends well. Look at this setup. Staff A creates a vendor, manager B approves it, and finance C processes the payment. If one person held all 3 roles, they could easily invent a fake vendor and secretly drain the accounts themselves. No way we want that. Component 4 is information and communication. Now, obviously, data has to be accurate, timely, and accessible, but the flow is what's absolutely crucial here. It's a two-way street. You've got your downward flow, that's management, clearly broadcasting expectations and policies, but you desperately need that upward flow too, where employees feel totally safe reporting red flags. I mean, this is exactly why anonymous whistleblower channels are a non-negotiable part of a healthy internal control system. And the 5th and final core piece, monitoring activities. Because controls are totally useless if they're outdated. They have to be continuously evaluated. When you catch a weak spot, you run it through a clear deficiency process. You document what you found, figure out how severe it is, build a remediation plan, and track the corrective actions. Say your monitoring catches a gaping hole in IT access controls. This specific process ensures the vulnerability doesn't just end up as a bullet point on a neglected report, but actually gets patched.
All right, Section 4. Let's see COSO in action, specifically looking at procurement. Let's take all this theory and actually ground it in reality. We'll look at a department every single company deals with: purchasing. Procurement is inherently risky, guys. We're talking unauthorized purchases, duplicate payments, and the always terrifying threat of vendor fraud. Because this is the area where cash actually leaves the building, it's basically a giant bullseye for human error or malicious intent. So, how do we stop that fraud dead in its tracks? We rapidly deploy COSO controls right across the department. For control activities, we lock down strict vendor approval processes, enforce three-way matching on invoices, and require clear payment authorizations. For info and communication, we're pulling monthly procurement reports. And for monitoring, boom, annual internal audits on purchasing transactions. By stacking these controls, you're not just slashing your fraud risk, you're actually making the whole operation run a lot smoother. Finally, Section 5, best practices and benefits. We're going way beyond basic compliance here. Look, to wrap up the anatomy of this framework, we have to acknowledge the realities of rolling it out. It's not always sunshine and rainbows. Even a world-class framework is going to faceplant if management doesn't care or if your documentation is a mess. But honestly, the most dangerous trap? Control fatigue. That's when your team starts looking at crucial security steps like they're just annoying pop-up ads, just a bureaucratic hurdle to bypass. To make this work, you absolutely have to balance ironclad risk management with actual day-to-day efficiency, or you'll just burn everyone out. But, and this is a big but, when you do overcome those challenges, the strategic benefits are off the charts. You pivot from just surviving to actually thriving. A solid COSO setup gives you better corporate governance, a massive drop in fraud risk, and way better decision-making because you can actually trust your own internal data. Plus, it makes SOX compliance a breeze for public companies. At the end of the day, it just skyrockets stakeholder confidence. Investors, regulators, your customers, they all know you're running a resilient, tight ship. So I want to leave you with this to chew on. Is your internal control system just a bureaucratic obstacle, or is it a strategic tool for sustainable growth? With business complexity and cyber threats going totally off the charts right now, having a killer internal control system isn't just about checking a compliance box anymore. It is the very engine of your organization's survival. Take a hard look at your own defenses and ask yourself, are we truly protected? Thanks for tuning into this explainer. Stay secure, and I'll catch you next time.